I never noticed how loud rain could be until I lived alone. The persistent drumming against my small apartment window had become a familiar soundtrack to my solitude. 22 years old, halfway through my bachelor's degree, and already feeling like I'd aged a decade. The city had promised opportunity. What it delivered was anonymity. Apartment 4B had been my home for 7 months. Just enough space for a bed, a desk crushed against the wall, and the constant reminder that this was what independence looked like: ramen noodles for dinner and rain-soaked socks drying on the radiator. Fuck, I muttered, watching the water seep through the ceiling corner for the 3rd time this month. I grabbed the plastic bucket I now kept permanently by my bed and positioned it under the growing stain. The maintenance man had promised to fix it weeks ago, but promises meant little in this building. Lightning cracked outside, briefly illuminating my sparse walls before plunging everything back into shadow. Then, as if on cue, the lights flickered once, twice, and died. Perfect. I fumbled for my phone, activating the flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing the peeling paint and water damage I normally try to ignore. With no other choice, I ventured toward the door. The building's super had an emergency generator for situations like this, but getting his attention always required physical presence. The man refused to answer his phone after 8 p.m. The hallway was eerily silent as I stepped out, save for the distant thunder. My neighbors seemed content to wait out the darkness in isolation, all except for the soft glow emanating from beneath the door of 4A. I'd seen the tenant of 4A only a handful of times since moving in. A tall man, probably in his late 40s, with salt and pepper hair that looked perpetually disheveled. He always wore button-up shirts with the sleeves rolled to the elbows, revealing forearms mapped with veins. We'd exchanged maybe 3 words total, variations of morning and evening mumbled in passing. The building manager had once referred to him as Mr. Harlow, when warning me that he values his privacy. The way she'd said it made him sound like some reclusive novelist or disgraced celebrity. In reality, he just seemed tired. The kind of tired that seeps into your posture and settles around your eyes. Just as I was about to continue toward the stairwell, his door opened. The soft glow I'd noticed spilled into the hallway. Candlelight, I realized. Mr. Harlow stood in the doorway, a tall silhouette against the warm light behind him. "Power's out," he said. His voice was deeper than I remembered, with a slight rasp that suggested either cigarettes or disuse. "Yeah, I was just going to find the super," I replied, suddenly aware of how I must have looked: worn sweatpants, an old university t-shirt with a coffee stain on the collar. Hair I hadn't bothered to wash that morning. Won't do much good. Rodriguez left yesterday for his daughter's wedding in Tampa. Won't be back until Tuesday. He paused, glancing down at the small puddle forming at my feet from my saturated socks. "Your ceiling leaking again?" The "again" caught me off guard. Had he heard me cursing at the water damage through our shared wall? Had I been that loud? "Yeah," I admitted. 3rd time this month. He nodded, as if this confirmed something he already knew. "I have candles, extra flashlights too." He hesitated, then stepped back slightly. "If you need one." The invitation hung between us, understated yet unmistakable. In 7 months, this was the most words we'd ever exchanged, and now he was offering me, what? Shelter? Companionship? A dry place to wait out the storm? That would be great, actually. "Thank you." The words tumbled out before I could overthink them. He nodded again and stepped aside to let me in. His apartment was the mirror image of mine in layout only. Where my walls remained bare save for a single-frame photograph of my parents, his were covered with bookshelves and artwork, prints of paintings I vaguely recognized from art history classes. A worn leather couch faced a small television that wasn't turned on. Instead, several candles burned on the coffee table, casting dancing shadows across the room. "I'm Julian," I offered, suddenly realizing we'd never properly introduced ourselves. "Daniel," he replied. "Harlow, but just Daniel is fine." Daniel. The name suited him somehow, simple, solid, carrying a weight that matched his presence. "You can sit," he said, gesturing toward the couch. "Would you like some tea? I was about to make some. Gas stove, he added, as if anticipating my question about how he planned to boil water during a power outage. Sure, I nodded, feeling strangely formal. Tea would be nice. As he moved to the kitchen, separated from the living room by only a breakfast bar, I took the opportunity to study him more closely. He moved with a deliberate grace that belied his size. Broad shoulders tapered to a narrow waist, and despite his age, which I guessed to be around 45, there was a strength in his frame that suggested he took care of himself. His hair was darker than I'd initially thought, the silver concentrated mainly at the temples. In the candlelight, his features seemed softer than they did in the harsh fluorescence of the hallway. Earl Grey, okay? He asked, his back to me as he filled a kettle. Perfect. I remained perched at the edge of his couch, unsure how to occupy the space. You're in school? He asked, striking a match to light the gas burner. Yeah, architecture, second year. He nodded, seeming genuinely interested. Explains the drafting table I saw you hauling up the stairs last semester. The fact that he remembered such a detail caught me off guard. I'd struggled with that table for 20 minutes, sweating and cursing as I tried to navigate the narrow stairwell. Eventually, I'd propped it against the wall to catch my breath, right as Daniel had emerged from his apartment. He'd given me a brief nod before disappearing down the stairs. He hadn't offered to help, and in my exhaustion, I'd labeled him as indifferent. Yeah, that thing was a nightmare to get up here. I laughed softly. Worth it, though. Architecture, he repeated, as if testing the word. Creative profession. Do you enjoy it? The question seemed sincere rather than just polite small talk. I found myself answering honestly. Most days. The studio classes can be brutal, professors tearing apart work you spent weeks on. But there's something, I don't know, meditative about creating spaces, you know? Thinking about how people will move through them, how light will fall at different times of day. Daniel turned to face me, leaning against the counter while the kettle began to whistle. I imagine there's something powerful about that, creating the physical context for people's lives. The observation was unexpectedly profound. Most people just asked if I was going to design skyscrapers. What about you? I asked. What do you do? A small smile tugged at the corner of his mouth as he poured water into a teapot. I restore books, rare volumes, first editions, damaged manuscripts. I have a workshop downtown. Book restoration? I couldn't hide my surprise. I didn't even know that was a job. A dying art, he acknowledged, bringing the teapot and 2 mugs to the coffee table. But there are still people who care about preserving certain texts. Libraries, collectors, universities. As he set down the mugs, I noticed his hands, strong but graceful, with long fingers that moved with precision. They were working hands, with small scars and calluses that spoke of years manipulating tools. I've always liked the smell of old books, I offered lamely, immediately regretting such a banal comment. But Daniel didn't seem to mind. It's the linen in the paper, he explained, pouring the tea. It breaks down over time and releases vanillin, same compound that gives vanilla its scent. Different papers age differently, depending on their acidity and manufacturing process. There was a subtle animation in his voice now, a quiet passion that transformed him. The severe, reserved neighbor had momentarily disappeared, replaced by someone warmer. How do you get into something like that? I asked, genuinely curious. He handed me a mug of tea, and our fingers brushed. His were warm from handling the hot teapot. Something small and electric passed between us, so brief I might have imagined it. My father was a printer, he said, taking a seat in an armchair across from me. Traditional letterpress. I grew up around paper and binding materials. Studied literature in college. Worked at the university library in their preservation department. He shrugged slightly. Eventually apprenticed with a master restorer in Chicago. Opened my own workshop 12 years ago. I cradled the warm mug between my hands, inhaling the fragrant steam. That sounds purposeful. Daniel looked at me with a curious expression. Purposeful? Like you were saving something valuable, I clarified, something that might otherwise be lost. He was quiet for a moment, studying me with an intensity that made me want to look away, yet somehow I couldn't. Yes, he finally said. I suppose that's exactly it. Thunder rolled outside, closer now. The rain had intensified, drumming against the windows and sheets. A flash of lightning briefly outshone the candles, and in that stark white light, I caught a glimpse of something vulnerable in Daniel's expression. Something raw and unguarded that vanished so quickly, I wondered if I'd imagined it. Do you live alone? The question escaped before I could consider how intrusive it might sound. If Daniel was offended, he didn't show it. Yes, for about 5 years now. The statement hung in the air, heavy with unspoken history. I wanted to ask more. Was there a divorce, a death, a choice to be alone? But something in his posture suggested boundaries. Me too, I said instead. Live alone, I mean. First time, actually. It's different than I expected. Daniel took a sip of his tea. How so? I struggled to articulate the feeling that had been haunting me for months. It's like, there's a difference between being alone and feeling lonely, right? I thought living by myself would feel liberating. No roommates eating my food or playing video games at 3 a.m., but most nights it's just quiet, too quiet. The confession felt excessive, too intimate for our first real conversation. But the darkness and the storm created a strange pocket universe where normal social rules seemed suspended. The silence gets loud, Daniel said quietly, as if he'd read my thoughts. You start to hear everything, the building settling, pipes knocking, your own heartbeat. Exactly. I felt a rush of relief at being understood. Sometimes I turn on the TV just for background noise, even though I'm not watching it. Daniel nodded. I use records myself. There's something less intrusive about music than television, less demanding of attention. As if to illustrate his point, he rose and moved to a record player I hadn't noticed in the corner. After carefully selecting a vinyl from a nearby shelf, he placed it on the turntable and lowered the needle. Soft piano notes filled the room, something classical that I couldn't identify but found immediately soothing. Debussy, Daniel said, returning to his seat. Clair de Lune. Seemed appropriate for the weather. The music wove itself into the rhythm of the rain, creating a cocoon of sound that felt both melancholy and comforting. I sank deeper into the couch, the tension I hadn't realized I was carrying beginning to dissolve. This is nice, I said softly, immediately feeling childish for such a simple observation. Daniel's eyes met mine across the coffee table. Yes, he agreed. It is. We sat in companionable silence for a while, listening to the interplay of rain and piano. I studied his apartment more closely, the books organized by some system I couldn't decipher, the lack of personal photographs, the careful arrangement of every object. This was the home of someone who paid attention to details, who created order deliberately. Do you miss it? I finally asked. Living with someone else? Daniel considered the question carefully, turning his mug between his hands. Sometimes, he admitted, not the complications that come with sharing space, but the small things. Having someone to tell about your day. The casual touch when you pass in the hallway. He paused, his eyes focused on the candle flame. The certainty that someone would notice if you didn't come home one night. The raw honesty of his answer caught me off guard. It revealed a loneliness that mirrored my own. More mature, perhaps, more resigned, but fundamentally the same emptiness. I get that, I said. I talk to my plants sometimes, just to hear a voice. Even if it's my own. Daniel's smile reached his eyes this time, creating fine lines at the corners. What do you tell them? Mostly complaints about my professors, I laughed, or play-by-play commentary of whatever I'm cooking. Now we're adding salt to pasta water. Revolutionary stuff happening in the kitchen today, folks. His laugh was unexpected, a deep, rich sound that seemed to surprise even him. It transformed his face entirely, erasing years and the perpetual seriousness I'd come to associate with him. I do the same with books I'm restoring, he confessed, telling them what I'm doing to fix them, as if they can appreciate my efforts. Do they ever talk back? I asked, emboldened by the moment of connection. Only the really old ones, he replied with mock seriousness. They've seen enough to have opinions. We both laughed then, and something shifted in the space between us, a ease that hadn't been there before. The candlelight flickered across his features, highlighting the strong line of his jaw, the subtle cleft in his chin, the expressive movement of his eyebrows as he spoke. I found myself noticing details I had no business noticing. The way his throat moved when he swallowed, the slight curl of hair at the nape of his neck, how his rolled sleeves revealed strong forearms with a dusting of dark hair. Heat crept up my neck, and I was grateful for the dim lighting. More tea, he offered, reaching for the pot. Please. As he leaned forward to pour, the candlelight caught the silver in his hair, making it gleam. Up close, I could smell him, a complex scent of paper and leather, and something warmer, like amber or cedar. Our knees almost touched across the coffee table, and I found myself holding my breath, though I couldn't have explained why. His hand trembled slightly as he poured the tea, a single drop spilling onto the wooden surface. Without thinking, I reached out to steady the pot, my hand covering his. His skin was warm, the bones and tendons solid beneath my fingers. Time suspended. The record had reached its end, the needle softly hissing in the groove. Rain continued to fall, but distant now, the storm moving away. Neither of us moved for what felt like several heartbeats. Then Daniel cleared his throat and withdrew his hand, setting down the teapot with deliberate care. Sorry, he murmured. Hand cramp, hazard of detailed work. No problem, I said, my voice sounding strangely high to my own ears. I wrapped my fingers around the freshly filled mug, needing something to do with my hands. A silence settled between us, different from the comfortable quiet of before. There was a tension now, a current of something unnameable that made the air feel thick. How did you end up in this building? I asked, desperate to restore the easy conversation. It doesn't seem like the typical place for someone with a specialized profession. If Daniel noticed my awkward recovery, he didn't show it. I used to have a larger place in Westwood. After my divorce, I wanted something simpler. Somewhere I could just be. This neighborhood is quiet. The rent is reasonable. I can walk to my workshop. Divorce, I repeated, the word answering one of my earlier unspoken questions. I'm sorry. He shook his head. Don't be. It was a long time ago. 5 years, like I said. Still, I offered, it must have been difficult. Daniel looked at me then with an intensity that made me feel seen in a way I rarely experienced. Life rarely gives us what we expect, Julian. Sometimes that's devastating. Sometimes it's clarifying. The way he said my name, soft, almost reverent, sent a shiver down my spine. There was something in his gaze that made me feel both vulnerable and safe simultaneously. Clarifying how? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He seemed to consider his response carefully. When you lose something you built your life around, you're forced to examine what remains. Who you are without the roles you played, what you actually want versus what you thought you should want. The words resonated somewhere deep inside me. I thought about my own expectations, the degree I was pursuing because it would make my parents proud, the relationships I'd attempted because they looked right on paper, the careful construction of a life that sometimes felt like it belonged to someone else. And what did you discover? I asked. About what you actually want. The question hung between us like a tangible thing. Daniel's eyes never left mine, and in them I saw a flicker of something that made my heart race, recognition perhaps, or possibility. The lights came on suddenly, the harsh overhead fluorescence shattering the intimate bubble created by candlelight. We both blinked, momentarily disoriented by the abrupt return to ordinary reality. Power's back, I stated unnecessarily, feeling strangely disappointed. Yes, Daniel agreed, rising to turn off the lights again. The room returned to the gentle glow of candles. Though I prefer this, he added quietly, resuming his seat. I glanced at my phone. 11:37 p.m. I'd been in his apartment for nearly 2 hours. I should probably go, I said reluctantly, though I made no move to stand. Let you get some sleep. Daniel looked down at his mug, then back at me. A war seemed to play out behind his eyes, restraint battling against something else, something raw and honest and perhaps a little desperate. You don't have to go yet. If you don't want to, he said finally, his voice barely audible above the now distant thunder. The words hung in the air between us, loaded with unspoken meaning. His expression was carefully neutral, but his eyes betrayed him. Vulnerable, hopeful, and tinged with something that looked remarkably like fear. I sat frozen, the implications of his invitation washing over me like the rain against the windows. The space between us seemed charged with electricity, with potential energy waiting to be released. Whatever I said next would change something fundamental between us, and I realized, with startling clarity, that I didn't want to leave at all. You don't have to go yet, if you don't want to, he said finally, his voice barely audible above the now distant thunder. The words hung in the air between us, loaded with unspoken meaning. His expression was carefully neutral, but his eyes betrayed him. Vulnerable, hopeful, and tinged with something that looked remarkably like fear. I sat frozen, the implications of his invitation washing over me like the rain against the windows. The space between us seemed charged with electricity, with potential energy waiting to be released. Whatever I said next would change something fundamental between us, and I realized, with startling clarity, that I didn't want to leave at all. I'd like to stay, I said softly, holding his gaze. Daniel exhaled slowly, as if he'd been holding his breath. Something shifted in his expression, relief, perhaps, or surrender. He reached for the teapot, found it empty, and set it back down with a small, self-conscious smile. I have something stronger than tea if you're interested, he offered, rising from his chair. Scotch. I'd like that, I replied, though I rarely drank anything stronger than beer. Tonight felt like an exception to many rules. Daniel moved to a cabinet near his bookshelf, returning with a bottle of amber liquid and 2 short glasses. He poured a modest amount into each, then handed one to me. Our fingers brushed again, and this time the contact lingered for a fraction longer than necessary. 2 unexpected power outages, he said, raising his glass. 2 unexpected company, I countered, lifting mine in return. The scotch burned pleasantly as it went down, warming me from the inside. I'd always found the taste medicinal in the past, but this was different, smoky and complex, with hints of honey and oak. Good? Daniel asked, watching me over the rim of his glass. Very, I nodded, though I'm no connoisseur. Neither am I, really, he admitted. This was a gift from a client, a rather generous one. I've been saving it for... He paused, searching for the right words. A significant occasion. The implications of that statement weren't lost on me. Whatever was happening between us, Daniel considered it meaningful enough to warrant opening something he'd been saving. The thought sent a strange flutter through my chest. He moved to the record player again, carefully removing the finished album and selecting another. After a moment of consideration, he chose a different record. The soft strains of a guitar filled the room, followed by a voice that was deep and melodic, singing about rivers and changing seasons. Nick Drake, Daniel explained, returning to his seat, though this time he chose to sit beside me on the couch rather than across from me in the armchair. Pink Moon, from the 70s. He died young, before he was truly appreciated. The melancholy in the music matched the rain-soaked night perfectly. We sat side by side, neither of us speaking for several minutes, just listening to the haunting vocals and delicate guitar work. The space between us on the couch was small enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from his body, though we weren't quite touching. Sometimes I think that's the true tragedy, Daniel said finally, his voice gentle in the near darkness. Not being seen for who you really are, not in time. The candlelight caught the contours of his profile, the straight nose, the thoughtful set of his mouth, the slight furrow between his brows. He looked like a figure from a Renaissance painting, all shadow and light and quiet dignity. Is that what happened? I asked carefully. With your marriage? Daniel took another sip of his scotch before answering. In a way, though the fault was mine as much as hers. You can't be truly seen if you're hiding parts of yourself. His words carried the weight of deep personal reckoning. I found myself wanting to know everything, the full story of his life, the experiences that had carved those lines into his face, the joys and sorrows that had shaped him into the man sitting beside me now. Which parts were you hiding? I asked, the scotch making me bolder than I might otherwise have been. Daniel's eyes met mine, searching. Whatever he was looking for, he seemed to find it, because he continued. The essential ones, he said simply. The parts that make up who I really am. Beneath the roles I was playing. He rotated the glass between his palms, watching the liquid catch the light. I married Charlotte when I was 26. She was brilliant, still is, a literature professor with a passion for modernist poetry. We made sense on paper. Same interests, compatible life goals, mutual respect. He paused, taking another sip. But there was always something missing. A connection I couldn't seem to forge, no matter how much I wanted to. His voice grew softer. At first, I thought it was just the natural fading of early passion. Then I wondered if there was something wrong with me, some fundamental inability to love properly. It took me years to understand that I was trying to force myself into a life that wasn't mine. The admission hung in the air between us, its implications clear, yet still unspoken. I felt a surge of admiration for his honesty, for the courage it must have taken to face such a truth about himself. How did you know? I asked. When you finally understood? Daniel's smile was tinged with sadness. There wasn't one moment of revelation. Just a slow accumulation of evidence I couldn't ignore anymore. Times when I'd find myself looking at a man on the street and feeling awake in a way I never did with Charlotte. Dreams I'd dismiss in the morning. Books with characters who reflected parts of myself I wouldn't acknowledge. He shook his head. By the time I admitted it to myself, we'd been married for 11 years. I felt a tightness in my chest, imagining the years of quiet struggle, the internal battles fought in silence. Was she angry when you told her? Hurt, Daniel corrected, which was worse. Anger I could have weathered more easily, but seeing her pain, knowing I was the cause. He trailed off, his expression clouded with remembered grief. She asked why I'd married her at all if I'd known. The truth was, I hadn't fully known. Or rather, I'd convinced myself it was a phase, something I could overcome through sheer force of will. The music had shifted to a more somber track, the guitar notes falling like tears. I found myself moving slightly closer to him on the couch, drawn by some inexplicable need to comfort or be comforted. Do you still talk to her? I asked. Occasionally. She's remarried now, a colleague from her department. They have a daughter. His voice held no bitterness, only a gentle acceptance. She seems happy. I hope she is. And you? I ventured. Since then? Daniel met my gaze directly. I've been learning to live authentically. It's harder than you might think, after decades of self-denial. He hesitated, then added, There have been connections. Brief ones, nothing that lasted. I nodded, understanding more than he might have guessed. Though I'd come out in high school, fortunate to have accepting parents, I'd struggled to form meaningful relationships. Casual encounters and abbreviated romances had left me feeling increasingly hollow. I know something about that, I admitted. The brevity. Different reasons maybe, but similar outcome. Daniel didn't press for details, but his eyes remained on me. Attentive and surprisingly tender. And yet, here we are, he said softly. Two strangers who've lived next door to each other for months, finally having a real conversation because of a power outage. Are we still strangers? I asked. His smile reached his eyes this time. No, he said. I don't think we are. The record had ended again, but neither of us moved to change it. The silence that settled between us wasn't empty. It was charged with something new, a tentative understanding that felt both fragile and significant. I finished my scotch, letting the last drops warm my throat. Daniel took my empty glass, setting it beside his on the coffee table. When he leaned back, he was closer than before, our shoulders almost touching. Tell me something about yourself, he said. Something real. The request was simple but profound, not the usual getting-to-know-you questions about hometown or favorite movies, but an invitation to genuine vulnerability. I considered what to share, what part of myself I wanted him to see. I'm terrified of failing, I confessed, the words coming out before I could second-guess them. Not just in school, but at everything, living up to expectations. Being good enough. I stared at the candle flames, finding it easier than meeting his eyes. My parents sacrificed a lot for me to be here. First-generation college student, academic scholarship. There's this constant pressure to justify their faith in me, to make their struggles worthwhile. Daniel listened without interrupting, his attention a tangible thing. Sometimes I feel like I'm performing a version of myself, I continued. The dedicated student, the good son, the promising young man with a bright future. I laughed without humor. Meanwhile, I'm eating ramen for dinner 4 nights a week and talking to my houseplants. And what does the real Julian want? He asked gently. When he's not performing? The question cut straight to the heart of something I rarely allowed myself to consider. I don't know, I admitted. To create something meaningful, I think. To connect with people in ways that matter. To stop feeling like I'm always one step away from everything falling apart. As I spoke, I realized I was telling him things I'd never articulated to anyone. Not my closest friends, not my former partners, not even to myself in the privacy of my own thoughts. The irony, Daniel said after a moment, is that the performance itself prevents the very connections you're seeking. Trust me, I know. There was such understanding in his voice that I finally looked up, meeting his gaze. The compassion I found there made my throat tighten unexpectedly. How do you stop? I asked. Performing. You start by allowing yourself to be seen, he answered. Really seen by someone who makes it feel safe to do so. Whether by accident or intention, his hand had come to rest beside mine on the couch, our pinky fingers nearly touching. The tiny distance between us seemed charged with significance. Is that what we're doing? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. I think it might be, he replied, his eyes never leaving mine. Slowly, deliberately, I closed the minuscule gap between our hands, letting my little finger rest against his. It was the barest of touches, yet it sent electricity racing up my arm and through my chest. Daniel didn't pull away. Instead, after a moment of suspended breath, he turned his hand over, palm up, an invitation. I slid my hand into his, our fingers interlacing with a rightness that made my heart stutter. His palm was warm against mine, his grip firm yet gentle. We sat like that for what felt like an eternity, neither speaking, both watching our joined hands as if they held the answer to some essential question. I should put another record on, Daniel said finally, his voice rough around the edges. Okay, I agreed, though neither of us moved. When he eventually stood, the loss of contact left my hand feeling cold. I watched as he selected another album, noting the careful way he handled the vinyl, the precise movements of his fingers as he positioned the needle. A woman's voice emerged from the speakers this time, rich and soulful, singing about love and longing and regret. Nina Simone, he said, returning to the couch. My lover come back to me. He sat closer than before, our thighs almost touching. The space between us hummed with potential, with things still unsaid but increasingly understood. Would you like another drink? He offered. I shook my head. I'm good. The rain had softened to a gentle patter against the windows, no longer the driving force it had been earlier. One of the candles had burned out, leaving the room in even deeper shadow. In this half-light, the normal boundaries of everyday life seemed distant and unimportant. Can I ask you something? I ventured. Anything, he replied, and I believed him. Have you been watching me before tonight? The question might have seemed accusatory in another context, but that wasn't how I meant it. I'd felt his awareness of me in 100 small moments, passing in the hallway, the way his eyes would sometimes linger when he thought I wasn't looking, his knowledge of details from my life that suggested careful observation. Daniel didn't deny it. Yes, he admitted quietly. Not in a way that should make you uncomfortable, but I've noticed you. It would have been hard not to. Why? I asked, genuinely curious. He seemed to weigh his words carefully. Because you remind me of something. Someone I might have been in another life. With your determination, your creative focus, the way you carry yourself, like you're already bearing the weight of responsibilities beyond your years. His eyes found mine in the dimness. And because you're beautiful, Julian, I suspect you know that, but maybe not how much. The compliment caught me off guard, sending heat rushing to my face. No one had ever called me beautiful before, handsome occasionally, cute more often. There was something in the way Daniel said it that made it sound like a revealed truth rather than a casual flattery. I've noticed you too, I confessed. Your hands especially, the way they move when you talk, the precision in your gestures. Daniel's expression softened, a mixture of surprise and pleasure crossing his features. Emboldened by his reaction, I continued. I've wondered about you. What your life is like, what you think about when you're alone. I hesitated, then added, whether you were as lonely as you seemed sometimes. And what did you conclude? He asked, his voice low. That you were, I said simply. That maybe we recognized something in each other even before tonight. Daniel nodded slowly. I think perhaps we did. A comfortable silence settled between us. Nina Simone's voice filled the room, singing about the passage of time and the persistence of memory. Without fully intending to, I found myself leaning slightly toward Daniel, drawn by the warmth of his presence. I never expected this, he said softly, his eyes on the flickering candle flame. Whatever this is, I've grown accustomed to solitude. Made peace with it even. Does it scare you? I asked. Terrifies me. He admitted with a small, rueful smile. And you? Yes, I nodded, but in a good way, like standing at the edge of something vast and unknown, but knowing you want to step forward anyway. His hand found mine again, our fingers intertwining with an ease that belied how new this was. A good description, he agreed. The candles were burning lower now, the wax pooling at their bases. The storm had moved on completely, leaving only a gentle rainfall in its wake. Time seemed suspended in this quiet space we'd created between us. Julian, Daniel said, my name a question in his mouth. I turned to face him more fully. Yes? His free hand rose hesitantly, hovering near my face before gently, so gently, tracing the line of my jaw with his fingertips. The touch was feather-light, exploratory, sending shivers across my skin. Is this okay? He asked, his voice rough with emotion. Words failed me, so I nodded, leaning slightly into his touch. His thumb brushed across my cheekbone, then down to the corner of my mouth. I felt my lips part slightly, involuntarily. Time slowed as Daniel leaned forward, his eyes never leaving mine until the last moment, when they flickered down to my mouth. The first brush of his lips against mine was so soft it was barely there, a question, an offering. I answered by pressing forward, closing the last breath of space between us. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, as if we were both afraid the other might suddenly disappear. His lips were warm, slightly rough, tasting faintly of scotch, and something uniquely him. My hand came up to rest on his shoulder, feeling the solid strength beneath his shirt. When we broke apart, it was only far enough to breathe, our foreheads still touching. Daniel's eyes remained closed, his expression one of such naked vulnerability that my chest ached at the sight of it. I've wanted to do that since the first time I saw you struggling with that drafting table in the hallway, he confessed, his voice barely audible. The admission made me smile. You could have helped me with it, you know. His eyes opened, meeting mine with unexpected mirth. And reveal my interest so soon? I wasn't nearly brave enough. And now? I asked. His answer was to kiss me again, more confidently this time. His hand moved to the back of my neck, fingers threading through my hair, holding me close as if I might try to escape, though nothing was further from my mind. My own hands found their way to his chest, feeling the steady thump of his heart beneath my palm. This kiss deepened naturally, months of unacknowledged longing finding expression in the meeting of lips and breath and tentative explorations. When his tongue brushed against mine, I couldn't suppress a small sound of pleasure that seemed to encourage him further. Time lost all meaning as we kissed in the candlelight, learning each other through touch and taste and whispered questions. Is this all right? More of that. Just like that. Eventually, we pulled apart, both breathing harder. Daniel's hair was mussed where my fingers had raked through it, his lips slightly swollen. He looked younger somehow, the perpetual seriousness momentarily lifted from his features. Come here, he said softly, shifting his position on the couch and opening his arms. I moved into his embrace without hesitation, letting him gather me against his chest. We reclined together, my back to his front, his arm draped protectively around my waist. The position felt impossibly intimate, yet completely natural, as if we'd done this 100 times before. Comfortable? He murmured into my hair. Perfect, I replied, and meant it. The last candle guttered and went out, leaving us in near darkness, with only the faint glow from a streetlight filtering through the curtains. The record had long since finished, leaving only the gentle rhythm of the rain as accompaniment to our breathing. Tell me something else, Daniel said, his voice a rumble I could feel against my back. Something you dream about? I considered the question, feeling safer in the darkness to reveal more of myself. I want to design spaces that heal, I said. Not just functional buildings or aesthetically pleasing structures, but places that actually make people feel better somehow. Architecture as therapy. His arm tightened slightly around me, a gesture of approval or understanding. That's beautiful, he said, and entirely possible. What about you? I asked. What do you dream about? There was a pause before he answered, his breath warm against my neck. Connection, he said finally. The kind that doesn't require pretense or performance. A relationship where I can be fully myself, and the other person can be fully themselves, and we're both better for it. The simplicity and honesty of his answer touched something deep inside me. I found his hand where it rested on my stomach and laced our fingers together. I think that's what everyone wants deep down, I said. Perhaps, he agreed, but not everyone acknowledges it, or risks the vulnerability required to find it. We fell silent then, each lost in our own thoughts while remaining physically connected. The warmth of his body against mine, the steady rise and fall of his chest, the security of his arm around me. It all combined to create a sense of safety I hadn't experienced in years. Maybe ever. Daniel? I murmured, feeling sleep beginning to tug at the edges of my consciousness. His voice was similarly heavy with approaching slumber. I'm glad the power went out tonight. I felt rather than saw his smile as he pressed a kiss to my temple. So am I, Julian. So am I. The rain continued its gentle percussion against the windows as we drifted towards sleep, still entangled on his couch. In those last moments of wakefulness, I found myself thinking about the strange paths that lead people to each other. How something as mundane as a power outage could become the catalyst for such profound connection. Whatever this was between us, this fragile newborn thing still finding its shape, it felt like something worth exploring. Something worth protecting and nurturing. As I finally surrendered to sleep, Daniel's breathing deep and even against me, one last thought floated through my mind. Sometimes the most unexpected beginnings lead to the most beautiful journeys. And this journey, whatever it might become, had only just begun. Outside, the rain slowed to a whisper, washing the world clean for whatever tomorrow might bring.